So welcome back for week 3 of Bible Month. If you've been with us before, maybe you want to give us a quick wave to let us know that you're one of the faithful ones on the whole journey with us. It's good to have you back. I do hope you've enjoyed it so far. Last week we had Jane with us, and she led us through a very particular reading of the text. She was kind of looking at it from or bringing one particular womanist or feminist perspective of the story. And I'm aware that some of what Jane would have read would have been, somehow Jane reads the story would have been different to somehow you might naturally read the story. It's certainly different to my take on it. And all I want to say is that one of the things we're wanting to model, I guess, as we go through Bible Month together is the fact that we are better readers of the text and we are more faithful followers of Jesus when we open ourselves up to other people's readings and interpretations. That doesn't mean that we have to agree with everything that they say, but it does mean that actually, as we listen to them with compassion and as we listen to them with critical engagement in mind, we honor them and we honor the fact that the Holy Spirit is as present in them and guiding them in their reading as she is in us and guiding us in ours. And so actually that's one of the reasons we want to try and model this approach to hearing multiple angles and views and voices on the text, even those that might not necessarily be the way that we would naturally approach it or would be in keeping with our own particular assumptions or presumptions that we bring to the text. With that in mind, and without that sounding like too negative a setup, we have Gill this week giving us one particular reading of the text. And what she's going to do is she's going to explore the themes of money, sex, and power as she seeks to answer the question, whose story really is this? Actually, is this his story? Is this her story? Is this our story? How might we engage with those themes? And we have actually built this session particularly as one that might be good for young people to join in with, or would be good for those who work with young people to kind of explore. Because those are the themes that I suppose are particularly prevalent in the lives of kind of adolescents. The way that we're going to approach today's session is that we are going to, Gill is going to present some thoughts and some ideas, and then we're going to try and model a little bit of a kind of just a conversational Bible study. So it's a bit of a fishbowl exercise, and that we're going to try and model a little bit of what does it look like to have a robust and open and thought-provoking conversation. Because actually that would be one of the best ways of engaging young people in the Bible, is just to open up avenues of inquiry and let them have their say. And then once we've done that, we'll probably break down then into breakout rooms and give you an opportunity to just share your thoughts and reflections on everything that's been said. Does that sound okay to everybody? Give me a physical or a digital thumbs up. Wunderbar. Okay, well, I'm going to pray, and then Gill, I'm going to hand over to you, if that's all right. So let's just begin with a moment of quiet, shall we? Thank you, God, that through the ages, your people have tried to get to know you better through studying the Bible. Help us today to look again at what we can learn about you. Help us to see the interesting and the quirky, the revolutionary and the new perspective. Help us to find the assurance of your unfailing love for humanity. Help us to search for a deeper truth than the one we've known for what feels like forever. Help us to dare to ask the difficult or complex question as we seek to understand your will for us. Help us to stay sure of your grace as we grapple with the unexplained. Help us to see better the love revealed, the way of life encouraged, and the transforming good news contained within the pages of this book. And be with Gill as she leads us in our reading. Amen.
I'd just like to thank everyone for being here this afternoon and for giving me a bit of time to talk to you about how I've seen the book of Ruth recently. Bible month always seems to throw me into a bit of disarray with regards to my previous understanding of the books that it takes each time. And over the last few months, actually just before Christmas, when Corrymeela community actually used the book of Ruth in their Advent devotions, I've obviously revisited Ruth a number of times, and my perspective over the book has changed quite dramatically. I think probably I would say I was where Jane was a few months ago, and then in the last 12 months I seem to have moved into another space. And I think this has been influenced by people like Rachel Held Evans and Caroline Custis James as well, where they've been looking actually at the strong woman and how they work with men, and how transformation from working together comes and takes place. So when I was thinking back about the story of Ruth, I thought as a child that was literally just what it was. It was just a story. I didn't really engage with it. As I hit my teenage years and young adult years, I started to realise that there was sex and money and power in the story. So I started to get a little bit more interested in that. And I think for quite a while, I saw almost like, I suppose it's like a Cinderella story that I think actually many people still hold on to. And then my awareness rose. I saw Ruth as a victim of society, of manipulative older adults, of being a powerless young woman in a foreign land who had to use her body to gain any status. And I think I was at that stage with her for quite a long time. But recently, as I say, I've been grappling with another perspective. And that's the fact that the book of Ruth is actually full of rule breakers who've got real hearts for God. So I thought I'd take the three main characters of Naomi, Boaz and Ruth and sort of unpack that a little bit with you. So starting with Naomi, because the book starts and ends with her. And actually, I quite like the way that the book starts and ends. And I think it's one of those books that would actually translate really well to a stage play, where both the opening and closing scenes move to reveal Naomi. Anyhow, Naomi. Here's a woman really struggling with life and with God. And I think sometimes we focus on her bitterness without connecting with her pain. I mean, I think perhaps we might forget that she was an immigrant before Ruth was an immigrant. And so she's got a real sound understanding around that and how Ruth's circumstances are. And she's not only buried her husband, but her two sons as well. So she's a bereaved woman living far from home. So I don't think it would be surprising to suggest that she's actually a woman living with depression. And some people find God in those dark places, but certainly through much of the book, Naomi doesn't. And just a moment to think about the status of a widow, because even though she's seen as almost like a valueless person in a society, there's something about the power of a bereaved person, of a widow amongst us. Their presence amongst us reminds us about the fragility of life. And so I'm not surprised that God puts a widow on the front line, so to speak, because it's their presence that makes us feel uncomfortable and a little bit challenged. And I think that this holds as much relevance to today. I've seen women in church lose status when their husbands died, and including them becoming a threat to the other women in their community, because suddenly there's a woman without a partner in their community, and some women find that a threatening situation. So Naomi broke a rule, and she broke a rule that actually eventually led to her healing, because on that road from Moab to Bethlehem, she turned to her two daughters-in-law and she offered them emancipation. She offered them freedom. And she shouldn't actually have done that, because Hebrew widows were bound to remain with their husband's family. So she's actually breaking the rules. She causes an incident on the road to Bethlehem that actually changes history and provides a twist like we so often get in God's story. So what of Boaz? How did he break the rules? Well, maybe he's not so much about breaking them, but bending them so far back that they could break. Certainly, he relies on his power and status to bend rules for Ruth. Some might say he bends the rules for his own benefit. But maybe, being the man of honour, of Gill that he is, it's actually about showing that he can be even more devoted to Yahweh than he previously has been. So inviting Ruth to sit at his table is a big statement. It's the gleaner with the paid workers. Moab dining with Israel. A woman served by a man. A poor widow with a rich landowner. So maybe we can say that Boaz breaks the rules. I don't want to get too bogged down with the threshing floor scene. I think we focus too much on what might or might not have happened. And by doing that, we actually lose like the macro view of the story. Because whatever happens still leads to Boaz dropping all his plans the next day to help sort out the lives of two widows who are related to him. Is he like Richard Gere in the film Pretty Woman, coming to rescue Miss Vivian on his white charger? Or has he woken up to the fact that his family, including him, have been really slow to act in their familial duties to dead relatives' widows? And how Boaz leads that conversation with his kinsman, the man with no name, as we might like to call him, and the elders at Bethlehem's gate, I think is quite canny. Because instead of starting with the subject of Ruth, he talks land, he talks money and his inheritance. And we're talking the kinsman redeemer law, which is really appealing. That's appealing to the man with no name. And he's prepared to sign on the dotted line until Boaz throws in the levirate law of marrying your brother's widow. And it gives us a little bit of an example about the difference between the letter of the law, so, following things to the letter. So a childless man's brother should marry his widow to get pregnant and carrying on the family name, to the spirit of the law, which is sort of more about let's save the family by binding and moving forward together. Now, Boaz might have done all this because he wanted Ruth for himself, or it might have been because in Ruth, he sees Hesed. So that's that kind of love so deep for God and for others that it's selfless and sacrificial. And he also sees Gill. He calls her a woman of valor, like he's a man of valor. He sees her power and strength and honour. And through that, he actually sees probably the image of God. So this woman, this Ruth, deserves allegiance because she has such a strong heart for God. And then I come to the biggest rule breaker of them all, Ruth. So we know that Boaz's field welcomed gleaners already because Boaz lives for Yahweh. His generosity is fundamental to following Yahweh. Gleaners are welcome in Boaz's field. So if gleaners are welcome, why does she actually go and ask if she can glean behind the harvesters? Well, maybe it's because she's actually asking to glean straight behind the harvesters before the bundling into sheaves has actually been done. And if that's so, then isn't she actually questioning their practices? And that might be a bit of a shock coming from somebody who's not from round here. But instead of being affronted by that question, Boaz actually listens, and then he actually offers her more than she's asked for. I said I didn't want to go into the threshing floor scene, but I will go back to it. She doesn't actually follow Naomi's instructions, does Ruth? Because she was told to wait for Boaz's response, but instead she tells Boaz what to do. This younger person telling an older person, a woman telling a man, a worker telling the boss. The question is she proposing? Or on the other hand, is she telling him what needs to be done? That he's got kinsman redeemer responsibilities. And then we think, well, if she's gone and done that, she's actually messed it up, because he's not, strictly speaking, the kinsman redeemer, the man with no name is. But I wouldn't bet on it, because I think she's really sussed his Ruth. And she's gone and picked the most powerful and respected man to advocate for her and Naomi. Ruth constantly challenges the system, and she brings a fresh perspective on Jewish laws. And it's her commitment to Yahweh that defines her. She's not caught up in the culture or the demographics or what her mother-in-law thinks. I mean, Ruth and Boaz couldn't be at more opposite ends of the scale and opposite ends of society. But to me, there's an equality that shines through all the time. Because Ruth suggested a change in how to run his fields to Boaz, and he listened and responded. Ruth initiated the interaction on the threshing floor, and Boaz listened and mulled over whether to take advantage or to take the challenge. I think between them, their lines of communication are good. They could communicate well, and they seem to certainly learn from one another. So instead of this story being the battle of the sexes, maybe it's about what we can achieve together. And the question is, isn't that actually part of God's original vision for us as humans, to achieve things together, to nurture and to support and to be alongside each other? So I mentioned one of the theologians, the thinkers that I'd read about, Caroline Custis James. She actually throws up a suggestion in her book. Her book's called The Gospel of Ruth, so the good news of Ruth. And it's about the ending of the book. And this was like one of those things that sort of really got me thinking. Because I know that some of us are a bit perplexed, about why it's Naomi left holding the baby at the end. And this is the sort of thing she says. It's not word for word, it's me sort of summarising it a bit. By offering herself to Boaz, Ruth can bear a child in Naomi's place. And Boaz takes the place of the brother. So Elimelech's heir is produced and the family name and land is rescued. Maybe that's what Boaz sees all along. The ultimate rescue mission for Elimelech's family. And Naomi was too old to bear children, so Ruth takes that place. She's, in fact, it's suggested, a surrogate. It's not about starting a family, but rescuing a family. And by rescuing that family, it brings everything back to where it should be. And it's interesting because a lot of people talk about Ruth disappearing at the end of the story, but so does Boaz. And what we're left with is an older woman bouncing a baby on her knee, a child that holds the future for Naomi and her ancestors. And from that perspective, Ruth and Boaz accomplished more by working together for a purpose that was bigger than themselves, all because they both had such a heart for God. So, is it his story? Is it her story? Their story? Maybe it's our story. The end.
Thanks, Jill. That's really great. It's fair to say, I think there is an altogether more positive approach to the text than we necessarily had last week. If I can reflect back some of the stuff that I really like about it, I like the fact that you take an empathetic view to the characters, because I think that probably that's what the writer wants. I think the writer wants us to empathize with Naomi. I think that the writer wants us to appreciate the valor of Boaz. And I certainly agree with your desire to try and not get too bogged down in the threshing floor scene, because I think, yeah, I mean, if you want to go for stories of illicit sex in the Old Testament, there are some much better ones to call to mind than this one.
Most definitely.
And even in the life of King David, if you're after kind of some slightly tricky sexual sin skeletons in the closet, there are some more obvious ones to go to than this one as well, in the kind of family wardrobe. But one of the things I really love is I just don't think I'd ever thought of the rule breaker thing before. Like, I wasn't aware of the Naomi breaking kind of the rules in terms of actually giving people an opportunity to Ruth and Orpah an opportunity to go home. That was totally new to me. And whilst one of the reasons why I like Boaz as a character, and I think we're meant to like him, is because he goes out of his way to try and flex and stretch the rules in line with the spirit rather than keep to them. But what I loved the most was your identification of Ruth as having so much agency and power in this, because I think whether you are reading it with a more traditional view in mind, or whether you're taking the approach that Jane led us in last week, the tendency is to assume that Ruth is the pawn in everyone else's plans. So either Boaz is taking advantage of her, or Naomi is taking advantage of her, or she's kind of caught up without agency. And I'd never seen that thing before about as she actually goes beyond the advice of Naomi. So she doesn't just have a shower and put on some nice clothes and all the rest of it and go on the seduction. But she actually goes beyond that and takes a very powerful step. And for me, the power dynamics taking place at that point in the story are profound. That working together of someone who by rights shouldn't really have power, and someone who has from a traditionalist point of view holds all the power in Boaz. I find that really interesting, and it causes me to want to reflect a little bit, I suppose, on your kind of conclusion around isn't that what it was always meant to look like in the first place? I think it's a really lovely thing to draw out. It makes me reflect on the current situation, right? So if we take something which is very, very current right now, which is the kind of Black Lives Matter conversation and the riots taking place and some of the injustices taking place, there you have a group of people who feel disempowered, constantly butting up against those who are regarded as the powerful, and not necessarily working particularly effectively together, hence riots. And I just wonder, you know, if you were going to reflect on the story of Ruth with that in mind, you know, where does your brain go? What sorts of considerations come to mind?
Where does my brain go? I mean, to me, it goes right back to the beginning, doesn't it? Where I mean, if God's original purpose for us is to work together and to share together and share this earth together and look after this planet together, then it's about recognizing who's got the power in certain situations to be able to facilitate a better coming together and a better walking alongside. So you've always got this power dynamic going on. And with the Black Lives Matter thing, it's perhaps in the last, I don't know, it might be, I don't know, I think perhaps obviously I live in a white middle class bubble, but I'm certainly aware of a lot of my friends in the last few weeks sort of responding differently to this situation. I think we've had a number over the years. We've had sort of Black Lives Matter and sort of people stand up and put their head above the parapet a little bit. But I'm really aware of a number of my friends in particular at the moment who are really just driven and wanting to change the perspective of those of us who are white and recognising our white privilege. And recognising that we've got to take some responsibility. We're the ones who are the powerful ones. So therefore, you know, we're the ones that are holding the power here. So that actually it's our responsibility to look at how we behave and what our behaviour and attitude is, and that we by changing ourselves, we can change the situation for those that are sort of at the receiving end, I suppose. And you can see that with, you know, Boaz is a powerful, very powerful character. You know, he's kind of like, you know, the person in Bethlehem that everybody looks up to. He might not be sort of the mayor or something like that, but he's kind of like, I wouldn't even say a self-appointed leader. It's kind of people look up to him and look up to him for leadership, and he's modelling how to respond and behave with the poorest of the poor in his community.
Yeah, I liked that example that you pulled out of, he is humble enough to receive Ruth's challenges to the status quo, and actually and not react to that. And like you say, it's not like he's a self-appointed leader or anything. He's not an elder, but he is a person who recognizes his position of power and seeks to use that responsibly. And again, for me, one of the reasons why I like him as a character is because I see in him, he appears to be someone who takes very seriously the Jewish legal structure, which a lot of is about actually elevating the position of the weak and trying to look out for that. You know, so many of the Levitical laws are around actually how do you look after the widow, the orphan, and the foreigner among you. And actually, to a certain extent, Ruth kind of comes to us almost as all three.
Yeah,
you know,
definitely.
she is both a widow, but she's certainly a widow. She's certainly a foreigner, and actually, you know, that, you know, we don't know about her orphan status, but you know, family has been pulled away from her, I suppose, in a certain way, and so you see in Boaz someone taking care of him, but in a way that doesn't detract from her agency. Somehow, you know, he like you know, so that image of, is he a rescuer, is he coming in kind of Pretty Woman style? I don't see that, because I see her still being able to exercise agency and power and kind of a certain level of self-determination. You know, it's not all on him. And you know, it makes me think, again, going back to the Black Lives Matter thing, I think there is something about learning to reckon, those of us who are in a position of power, learning to recognize it and exercise it in a way that elevates and empowers those who would otherwise be disempowered. And what I think is really interesting is I don't think that bypasses the fact that there is a you know, it doesn't mean that the story ends with them on an equal footing, but it does end in a way that enables them to work together. So it doesn't eliminate the power dynamics. You know, I'm not saying we shouldn't try and eliminate the power dynamics, but I suppose it's a slightly more realistic view, in that it doesn't try and do away with them, but it seeks to basically say, those of you who are in power, what does it look like to empower other people so that they feel like they can exercise agency? So your agency is elevating their agency. So it's seeking to bring balance and seeking to humble yourself for the other, so that they don't have to fight or riot or be disadvantaged anymore.
Absolutely.
And I honestly so grateful, because I don't think I'd ever seen it portrayed in quite those terms before. And actually, the more you think about it, the more clear cut it feels.
I mean, it's really funny because, like I say, I mean, I was in Jane's place, you know, for kind of like, once I'd moved from this sort of, you know, I think for a long time I was in the Cinderella story of, like, you know, oh, look at Boaz rescuing everything. And we talked the other day about that sort of the line that we kind of, that makes me groan, is like, particularly in America, a lot of women, Christian women, sort of who are unmarried or whatever, talk about, I'm waiting for my Boaz, you know, and it's like this sort of, and I've lost my complete train of thought there. But so the Cinderella story, and then I moved into, as I became sort of, I suppose, more sort of socially aware, politically aware, sort of, and aware of myself as a woman, I started, I think perhaps I did, you know, I kind of have looked at it and thought, God, poor Ruth, you know. It's like Naomi's pushing her that way, and Boaz is pulling her this way, and you know, and then, but actually sort of starting to look at it and starting to see that she's like this conduit of bringing the whole thing together. She is the transformation, you know, she is the transformer in this whole situation. And I, you know, you couldn't obviously you couldn't have the Book of Ruth without Ruth in it. I mean, I started thinking, what, you know, why is it not called the Book of Naomi? Because it starts with Naomi, and it is all about Naomi. It's all about, you know, it starts with Elimelech and the sons and the doom and gloom at the beginning of it. And like I say, then everything sort of stands back, and you're left with Naomi and Naomi's story. But Ruth is fundamental to that, and she's I mean, another thing that people say about the Book of Ruth is there's hardly any mention of God in it. You know, you don't see God in it really, and I think actually, isn't Ruth the face of God in this? Wow. You know, and the transformation and the way she weaves right the way through it. And stands back at the end, you know, in talking about empowerment. Part of the process of empowerment, particularly with when we're working with young people, is about actually standing back at the end of it and going, right, now it's over to you. And it is almost like that at the end. It's like, my work here is done, and we're left with Naomi holding the baby, literally at the end of the book. So
there is something lovely as well, isn't there? You know, trying to find the center of who's at the center of the story. Is it his story? Is it her story? Is it Naomi's? Is it Boaz's?
Yeah.
And one of my ongoing reflections around the nature of God and what the Bible seems to point towards is that actually God is in the business of making room for the other, and a huge amount of being a follower of the way of Jesus is about making room for the other. And actually, the very fact that it's really hard to pinpoint who's the hero or heroine here is because what you see is this lovely dynamic of people making room for the other. You see this lovely, Naomi is making room for Ruth in her world, and Boaz makes room for Ruth in his. And then both of them make room for Naomi's redemption at the end with the grandson. And there's this constant defer, and it does remind me. I can't remember who paints it, but that famous picture of the Trinity, where they're kind of sat around three sides of a four-sided table, and we come to it as the fourth person.
Yeah.
And they all seem to be pointing or nodding to one another, such that that there's that deference to the other.
Yeah.
Which actually comes through beautifully in this.
Yeah, it does actually. I've not thought of the Trinitarian kind of aspects of this either. But...
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't want to necessarily stretch that point too far.
But that kind of three together.
These three interwoven characters who seem to be honoring one another and making space for one another, and preferring one another, and I think that's really beautiful. And I think that is what I mentioned this in our first week, but one of the things I find really interesting about the book of Ruth is that there's a key argument in scholarship around, is this here as a foil for some of what else we get in the Old Testament? So particularly Ezra and Nehemiah, where all of the foreign women are expelled from the nation. There's all sorts of reasons why Israel's acting that way, but Ruth, the story of Ruth seems to kind of counteract all the logic behind that and kind of go, no, this is what it's all about. And actually, therefore, I do love the idea that actually what this story epitomizes is preference of other, and kindness and compassion, and making room, and that being a redemptive process for everyone. And I think where I want to land this before we go into breakout rooms is that lovely image as well that you pulled out right at the start of what happens is we see the coming together of Israel and Moab. And that's really profound. That who are Israel meant to be? Israel are meant to be the people who reconcile the whole world to God, who are a kingdom of priests who bring the world to God. And what we see here in the faithful following of Yahweh is that redemption of two nations appears to be embodied somehow, which we then see echoed in Matthew's gospel, where Matthew starts by wanting to say, hey, remember Ruth, and controversially includes women in the family lineage piece. And then immediately then we have Magi, so people from a foreign land who probably follow other gods and other religions, being brought into right at the heart of the beginning of this redemption story. I think there's something really powerful in that. That's important for us is when we're considering the power dynamics. I think also therefore for us to consider what does our power dynamic look like in terms of those who are other, in terms of other faith, other ethnicity, other gender, whatever the divisive lines are. How can we exercise agency either from a place of being disempowered and try and exercise agency to challenge the powerful, as Ruth did, or exercise agency and humble ourselves to receive that challenge, as Boaz did? Much to mull over. So thank you for pulling all that out. What I'm keen to do is, those of you who are watching at home or online, aware that we've had quite a lot of a chit chat there, and hopefully actually that's been an interesting conversation for you to be a fly on the wall for. That was the aim. It wasn't just self-gratification, although this is fun for both of us. But we're gonna split into breakout rooms, I think, for 10-15 minutes or so, just to give you an opportunity to chat through some of what you've heard, some of what stood out to you. Is there anything that surprised you? Is there anything that's actually frustrated you that you want to argue against? Because actually, this is what reading the Bible is about. It's about the dialogue. It's about engaging with it in community. That's how the text was designed to be used. So I'm gonna pop us into breakout rooms now. I think I'll say 12 minutes. as I say, have a good chat. We'll bring it back. We'll have a bit of a plenary, and then we'll set ourselves up for next week. Okay. See you shortly. Welcome back, everyone. I hope those conversations were interesting and stimulating, or an opportunity for you to vent, whichever mood you were in as you went into that space. We would just love to hear a little bit about some of your reflections, maybe some of what you've been thinking about or talking through in your groups. I did ask, hopefully you got the little message to say if you could nominate someone from each group to feedback. So maybe could someone feedback from breakout room 1, if you're aware that you're in breakout room 1, or if not, maybe you want to just raise your hand if you were, you might have to digitally raise your hand to let me know if you're someone who's going to feedback, and we'll invite you to speak.
Thank you. I think I was in group 1, I can't remember. The thing that we discussed towards the end was about Ruth giving the baby to Naomi. And I think the conclusion we came up with, forgive me if the rest if I got it wrong, was that it was almost certainly not right. He's yours now, get on with it. It was a share in looking after the baby, as was obviously pretty common if they were living in the same household. But it was also that when it was the levirate marriage thing, the brother would marry the widow in order to produce a son who would then take his dead father's name and inheritance. And Ruth was saying to Naomi, I've committed to you, I am part of your family. I'm having this child to be yours, to give you continue your family name and inheritance. We could be wrong, but I think that's the sort of conclusion that we thought was the most likely.
Yeah, good. And I think that's certainly in keeping with certainly how I read the text, and what I think the journey of Naomi is, from, you know, someone whose life is blessed to bitter to blessed again. You know, that she has this lovely kind of story arc, which I think is very carefully designed by the writer for us to receive. So thank you for that, Lorraine. What about, I think I ended up having to close group 2. So what about group 3, breakout room 3? Does anyone from there want to share some thoughts? You'll need to unmute yourself before you do.
I'm not sure what number I was in, really.
You were breakout room 3, Alan, so go for it.
Oh, right. Well, it was suggested that I be the spokesman. The one thing that I brought up, which is quite independent of what Gill said, is that, I mean, I didn't use the word parable, but it's like the parables in the Gospels where, you know, you're warned not to look at them in too much detail. It's just a general message. And to me, when I look at Ruth, in chapter 1, verse 8, Naomi is saying, may the Lord show kindness to you, or hesed, as you have shown to your dead and to me. May the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband. And then the rest of the story shows that, yeah, there was kindness shown to her, but she had to work for it. It didn't come to her, you know, drop down from heaven, as it were. She was a very feisty person, and she had to decide that she wasn't going to go hungry. She was going to go out and glean, and whatever opposition was put in her way, she would face it. And then she sort of had the bath and put the perfume on and went under the blanket. I mean, you know, what a determined woman she was, really. And you know, very often people think, well, if I pray, God will make things right. Well, that's only half the story. And this story is saying, yeah, God will show hesed, loving kindness, but you've got to get on with it and take all the advantages that may come to you. And if they don't come, you've got to make them, make opportunities for yourself. End of.
No, that's great. Thanks, Alan. I think you're right. There is something in there about there is a coming together of both dogged determination and hope in the promises of God that actually are not mutually exclusive in terms of behavior, but actually operate together, I think. So thank you for that. What about...
Having said that, I don't know if any of the others in the group feel that I've ignored what they said, because I've just contributed what I said.
Well, if you were nominated, then let's hear from breakout room 4, shall we? Anyone from there want to share back what you were talking about? Feel free to unmute yourselves and share. That was Janet, Melanie, Nita, or Patricia, for those of you wondering.
Well, I'll speak. I don't think we really nominated anybody, to be honest. We were looking at it, and I think we just agreed with what Gill was saying. I thought it was an interesting idea of being rebel takers, and how Ruth had such guts. I'd certainly not thought about the fact that she'd been young speaking to old, woman speaking to man, worker speaking to boss, and how that's a real challenge for us in terms of standing up and giving voice when we think something isn't right. And that's a challenge in these present days, for me at least.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. And absolutely received that challenge, because I think it's easy sometimes to feel compelled into inaction, or kind of overwhelmed into inaction, sorry, should I say. And actually to kind of think, okay, well, what does it look like for me to use what agency I do have? Even if I'm feeling overwhelmed is an interesting question. And similar to, I suppose, the point Alan raised, to what extent do I wait for change to happen, and to what extent do I go after it? Excellent, thank you. Room 4. Let's hear from room 5. So that's Gill, Nick, Navette, or Paul. Just remember to unmute yourselves before sharing.
I could say something, but Navette should. Okay. Maybe Navette can add in a moment. We discussed the Trinity point, that none of us have perhaps had thought of that really. And similarly, of Ruth being the face of God, which we found very helpful. But Navette really brought her feet back to the ground with it's a very up-to-date story that human nature hasn't changed and the situation is still the same. And it puts responsibilities on us today for our homeless and the people that are now being homed at the moment, because they have to be by government law, but that will change. And taking our responsibilities from that. So it spoke of today and a deep challenge for today.
Yeah.
Navette should say.
I think you covered it, Paul, very much. Yeah, very much that the role of the powerful and the powerless. But I've also always sort of seen Naomi and Ruth as a power couple. Who have, though they've been brought down so low, they make a decision to go home and restart life again, and they don't sit back, and which is the way that my experience of women from my background is always that they are initiating and entrepreneurial and taking charge in a way that they can within the confines that they have. With the whole idea of the Trinity, that does resonate with me, even though some people might see it's kind of stretched, but I hadn't seen that before, and I like that idea of them working together to accomplish something, all three of them.
Yeah. Thanks for that. Thank you for sharing. Thank you, Group 5. I'm aware that we are pushing time, but we want to make sure that we make space for everyone's voices. So can we just hear from Breakout Room 6? That's Abina, Joe, Kate and Morag. Unmute yourselves before sharing.
We talked a little bit about cultural context and also cultural conditioning and how that applies today. We referred a little bit to the situation of Black Lives Matter and moving on. I guess that ties in with what you were saying about agency as well.
Okay. Did you reach any particular conclusions in your discussions, Morag?
Maybe the others would come in with that.
We didn't discuss Ruth very much, I seem to remember. We had a young lady with us, Abina. Well, I said she was young compared to me. You know, lots of people are these days. We talked a lot about a post that I'd read on Facebook, and I'm still trying to find it, but I can't find it, which is infuriating, with regard to accepting things that happen in our time because they are of the time. And then so sort of saying, okay, well, that was fine then. And then moving on to another time, well, that was the time. And we should, you know, to actually say, well, that doesn't matter now. We shouldn't be bothered about that because it's now the time that we're living in. It's not acceptable what we've done all these times before. And it was interesting because Abina, I managed to drag out of Abina the fact that the vast majority of young Black people, her peers, are not wanting to live in the past, but wanting to live together in the present and moving forward to working together and living together in what the rest of the 21st century holds for us. Does that about cover it? My other colleagues in room 6. Interesting, that's the first Zoom meeting where I haven't been in room number 1. So it's quite nice to be in another room.
That's great. That sounds like a very interesting and stimulating conversation. And don't feel guilty that actually you wanted to springboard away from a text into actually some of the application, because actually obviously Bible Month is about that. It is about saying how does engaging with a text teach us to be more faithful followers of Jesus today?
Can I just say quickly one thing more that I've forgotten? All of us, I think, in the group, the 4 of us, felt that we were more in tune with what Gill had given us today than with what Jane had given us last week. That we felt happier with today's viewpoint as opposed to last week's viewpoint, although both were relevant and interesting.
Yeah, and thank you for sharing that. And I think that is the key, is as I say, you know, as we reflect today on the text and the important learning to how do we make room for the other reading of Ruth as much as the other those who are different to us, I suppose, in society as well. So yeah, but take the point. And
I know there's some terrible depictions of women in the Old Testament, but I do think it's unfair to come heavily with feminist criticisms of something that at that time, you know, would not be considered out of the ordinary, really. And we have to try and understand them.
But I think, yes, at the same time, I think the key point is that we need to be aware that when people pick up the Bible and see the things that they may find abhorrent or things that they would seek to automatically criticize, we need to be able to engage with that response, and we need to be able to engage with it well and with compassion and with listening ears. Definitely. Even as we might suggest that actually that may not be the authorial intent, it may not be the function that story held in the life of Israel, but it may be how they're receiving it now. And actually, I think that's one of the reasons why this is such a fascinating and an interesting exercise. But I do take the point, Alan. I would love to hear finally from room 7. Still want to hear everyone's voices. So Howard, you've unmuted yourself. Are you the nominated spokesperson?
I was bullied into it.
Okay.
I said it should have been someone from your own region.
Well, it's fine. Carry on.
But it was interesting. I think reflecting some of the feelings that have just been talked about there, and particularly with what Joe was saying about this being the group feeling that this was a gentler interpretation, a more rounded interpretation of the individual characters than they'd seen in last week's. It's interesting for me because I've got to review last week's, ready to deliver it on Friday. So it would be interesting seeing that. But very much picking on the idea of Ruth as doing her best. They found herself deeply committed to Naomi, trying to do her best for both of them, bearing in mind that if they didn't eat, it was life or death. We did raise the slight question as to how come Boaz was available to take a wife. Was he himself a widower, or had he already got a wife, but this rule allowed him to have a second or third, whatever? But yeah, generally just feeling it was a gentler interpretation. I think that was the key thing. I'm trying to catch the eye of Susan, who's she's smiling at me, so I think I've got it about right.
Sure. Okay. Well, thank you for feeding back, everybody. I'm glad that it sounds like, whatever you've kind of heard, I suppose, over the last 2-3 weeks, hopefully that it is creating an opportunity for stimulating discussion, for dialogue, for exploration, for being provoked, for listening to one another, to listening to the Spirit. That is what this whole process is all about. So thank you for being in it with us and participating in Bible Month with us, and actually for allowing people beyond our region and kind of on YouTube as well to be engaging with us in our dialogue too. I do appreciate that. We are back next week with a slight change in the norm, in that in 2 weeks' time, we're going to have Nigel Pimlott sharing a particular reading of Ruth that pays close attention to the themes of migration in the story. But before that, what we wanted to do was create space for you to bring your developing thoughts, and for us to have an opportunity for a bit more open dialogue and back and forth and debate and discussion. So next week, my request, my encouragement, my desire is that you come with a couple of thoughts, a couple of questions, a couple of points that you want to make about your developing interaction with the story. What are you sensing God is saying to you in the text so far? What have been some of the things that you've not seen before that you've suddenly realized? What have been some of the questions that you've been left asking that you don't necessarily have answers to? And we're going to create a forum for discussing them. Don't quite know how it's going to go. Don't quite know how the recording's going to work, but we're going to give it a go, because actually, again, the whole point is Scripture is designed to be engaged with dialogically, and so we didn't feel like we'd be doing our job properly if we didn't create a space for a whole session of that sort of dialogue. All that said, Gill, I just want to say thank you for everything you brought and prepared and kind of done for us today. Would you mind closing for us in prayer, and then we'll say goodbye. Thank you for sticking with it. Our apologies that we've gone on longer than we planned, but hopefully you found today fruitful and worthwhile all the same. But Gill, if you want to pray, and then we'll end our time together.
Okay. So let's take a moment to reflect on the conversations that we've had and think about what God might be saying to us in those conversations. Loving God, we give you thanks for our time together this afternoon. Thank you for being with us in our conversations and in our listening and sharing together, as we've learned and perhaps further understood a bit more about the story of Ruth. We give thanks that even in this time of uncertainty, we can come together like this and learn more about you and in the ways that we can serve you. And we ask that you bless us as we continue to share your love with others. May you continue to guide and inspire us in all that we do. And we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Thanks, Jill. Okay, we're going to do that awkward Zoom goodbye thing where I'm going to stick us on gallery view and everyone can wave goodbye. And we'll see you again next time. Thank you all. Have a good week. Bless you.